All right, welcome back to our next example. This is our third and last example in our section of examples from 3.4, categorical logic, and evaluating the validity of arguments using the Venn diagram test for validity. So this last example is going to be an example of a 3-circle Venn diagram test. And so that means that in this case, we're going to have 3 categories, hint, hint. All right, so let's first take a look at our argument. Our argument that we're working with in this video is some cats are pets. All pets are well cared for. Therefore, some cats are well cared for. So the first thing we have to do, as per usual, is identify our 3 categories. So 2 categories are really obvious off the bat from our first premise. We have cats, we have pets, and then it looks like we have well cared for. Now remember, when we have a predicate like well cared for, we have a strategy for turning that into a noun phrase. And the way we turn that into a noun phrase is we add this things that are to the beginning. So we have things that are well cared for. And so those make up our 3 categories. We have the category of cats, the category of pets, and the category of things that are well cared for. And those are all 3 categories contained in our 2 premises. Remember that when we use the Venn diagram test for validity, we want a single premise Venn and a single conclusion Venn. And we're comparing those 2 Venn diagrams. So we're going to want one Venn diagram that encapsulates all the information in both of our premises, in our first 2 premises. And so that's why we need all 3 of these categories. We need all 3 of these categories to figure out how to articulate all the information in both of those premises. So that means that our premise Venn diagram, is going to be a 3-circle Venn diagram. So it's going to look like this, with 3 circles and an overlap. Remember, 3 circles and their overlap should mean that we have 8 spaces. So if we need to check or we're counting, we can go ahead and check to make sure we did that right. So we've got 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, my apologies. It's 7, not 8. So let me just do that again. Hopefully you all can cut this out. So in order to check to make sure we did the overlap right, we can check and make sure that there are, in fact, 7 spaces of overlap, because remember, there are 3 spaces that don't overlap at all, 3 spaces of overlap of 2 categories, and 1 space where all 3 categories overlap. And so that's how we can check to make sure that we've drawn our 3 circles correctly if we need to. All right, and so now we label our categories. And so I'm going to go from the top down. I'm going to start with cats on top, pets on the left, and things that are well cared for on the right. And remember, it doesn't actually matter the order in which you label your categories. We could have switched these categories as long as you remain consistent. You have to remain consistent across your Venn diagrams, so that you're able to compare them. So whatever initial order you pick doesn't matter as long as you have consistency. Make sure you have consistency. So now the next thing we do is we're checking for categorical forms. And let's go ahead and remind ourselves we have 4 different categorical forms. We have all S are P, no S are P, some S are P, and last but not least, some S are not P. And now let's really quickly remember that these involve shading of our Venn diagram, which is basically the same as removing possibilities, right? So you're removing possibilities when you shade. You're ruling out possibilities is another way we might put it. And then our categories that involve some involve placing asterisks, right? And our asterisks are another way of ruling in possibilities. right? So shading rules out possibilities, asterisks rule in possibilities. All right, so first and foremost, we can now look at our first premise and notice that it very clearly has a form that rules in a possibility. It's of this form right here. It's of the form of some SRP. Specifically, we have some cats are pets. So that's pretty straightforward and easy to do. We did that in the 2 category example above, right, in the previous video. If some cats are pets, that means that we need to place an asterisk to note there's at least one thing in the intersection of being a cat and being a pet. And so where the category of pets and the category of cats intersect is right here. So that means that we need to place an asterisk right where I put that little squiggly circle. So we're going to go ahead and place an asterisk right there. Now, notice we have a problem, right? So I did this, but this isn't technically correct. Why is this not technically correct? Well, part of the issue is, what about this little area right here, right? What about that little area? Because that's also an area where cats and pets overlap, right? It's an area where cats and pets overlap. It's just also an area where they overlap with things that are well cared for, right? It's also an area where they overlap there. So at the moment, we don't actually know whether our asterisk should go on the left or whether it should go in the right-hand circle. And so that means temporarily, at the very least, we're going to go ahead and put our asterisk on the line in between. We're going to go ahead and put our asterisk right here, just at the moment, right? And then if something gets ruled out in the next premise, where that asterisk is might change. Now, our next sentence, right? Our next sentence, our second premise, says all pets are well cared for. So that is of our first form, of our form right here. All SRP. So now, all SRP involves ruling out possibilities or shading. So if all pets are well cared for, that means we need to rule out all the area where pets doesn't overlap with things that are well cared for. Because if there are pets, they're always going to be in the overlap of pets and things that are well cared for. Meaning they're always going to be in this overlap, right? So we need to rule out everything else. And so that means we shade the entirety of pets that doesn't overlap with things that are well cared for. And you might have just noticed something really important, right? And that is, we now can take our asterisk off the line, because notice, oops, let me go ahead and fix that. We can now take our asterisk off the line, and that is because we've ruled out the entirety of the area where cats and pets overlap that doesn't also overlap with things that are well cared for. So the only place now where cats and pets overlap is right here. Because before, the entirety of right here was our overlap between cats and pets. But we've now ruled that out we've ruled a whole bunch of that out using our second premise. See where all those lines are? All that shading is? We've ruled all that out. So that means we now know that our asterisk, where some cats are pets, has to be right here. And it has to be the case that we've got an asterisk right there. So that, right, so notice we didn't quite know if we had to leave our asterisk on the line or if our asterisk could be placed in a particular discrete location. But our second premise told us that we could then move the asterisk to a particular discrete location, right? We could move it precisely in here where it needed to go. So this is really important to note, right? It's really important to note that sometimes new premises will introduce new information. And this has actually given us a really good rule or principle that we can go by. If we have more than one premise, we should start with the universal premises. Start with the premises that start with the words all or no. because those premises rule out possibilities. They shade out spaces of our Venn diagram. And so they're going to provide us with information about where we can and cannot put asterisks. And so what would have been helpful to do in here that we could have done, otherwise, was to start with premise 2. Since premise 2 had an all in it, we could have started with premise 2 and then gone back to premise 1. And since we did this sort of silly, extra roundabout way of starting with premise 1 and then showing you the impact that premise 2 had on premise 1, you can now see why this is a helpful rule. You can see why there's this helpful rule of start with your universal premises. Your universal premises. All right. So now that we've finished our premise Venn, we want to go on to our conclusion Venn. And our conclusion Venn says, therefore, some cats are well cared for. So notice here our categories are cats and things that are well cared for. So same categories as above, but we only have 2 categories here instead of 3, which makes sense because it's only a single line, right? So some cats are well cared for. And last but not least, right, we have our categorical form is some SRP, right? So we're back to this same categorical form as before. So it's going to be an asterisk style categorical form. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a little bit. I'm going to try to make it so you can still see most of the conclusion. And we're going to draw our conclusion Venn. All right. So our conclusion Venn, we have cats as one of our categories, and we have things that are well cared for. And again, because this is an asterisk, some cats are well cared for just means there is an overlap between the things that are cats and the things that are well cared for, such that at least one thing that's a cat is a thing that's well cared for, right? So meaning there's at least one thing in the intersection of these 2 categories. So we can articulate that with just a little asterisk right in the intersection. And then we have to ask ourselves, is there any information contained within the conclusion Venn that's not contained within the premise Venn? And so an argument is valid in categorical logic just in case all the information contained in the conclusion is contained in the premise. So how do we determine that exactly here? Because notice you might be a little bit puzzled because there are only 2 circles. There are only 2 circles in the conclusion, whereas there are 3 circles in the premise, right? So how do we compare the 2? Well, the way that we compare them is we look in our premise Venn for precisely the circles that we have in our conclusion. So we're looking at the cat circle. Here, you know what? I will actually use a different color than red for this. So let's use blue. Blue's a good color. So we're looking specifically at the cat circle right here. And we're looking at the things that are well cared for circle. And we're asking ourselves, is there any extra information in the conclusion that's not contained in the premise? And notice, in fact, there isn't. Well, why? Because in the premise, we have an asterisk in the intersection between cats and things that are well cared for. And there is a little extra information in the premise. Namely, in the premise, there's this extra information that the asterisk is not only in the overlap of cats and things that are well cared for, but also in the overlap of pets. But the pet circle doesn't end up in our conclusion. And so that's not information that's present in our conclusion, right? But our conclusion says there is an asterisk in the overlap between cats and things that are well cared for. And that is an asterisk that we find in the overlap in the premise. And so this is an argument that is valid. It is a valid argument because there is no information in the conclusion that is not contained within the premise.